From WABE in Atlanta, this is Savory Stories, the show where we explore Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know the city's culinary creators and breaking down food-related stereotypes.
I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian, owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor, and author of A Culinary History of Atlanta.
And I'm Chef Asata Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, A Parent's Guide. Today, we're taking a trip down memory lane. Before this podcast came to life, the series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes.
We thought it would be great to revisit some of the archive episodes that shaped this show. And one of our favorite past episodes was this one on food as resistance, when we talked about Atlanta's connection to food, politics, and the civil rights movement.
So get ready to sink your teeth into this savory story.
Today, we are talking about one of my very favorite topics, and that is food as a form of resistance. And I know when we think of resistance, we immediately think of leaders like Dr. King, Congressman Lewis, and Mrs. Rosa Parks. But today, we are going to be sharing the story of food entrepreneurs and restaurateurs who resisted. In fact, I would venture to say that there is no city in America in which restaurateurs have risen up more than Atlanta. What do you think, Asada?
As an ATLian, I approve that message.
Resistance is in our food DNA, and giving back is who we are as a food community. This story of food resistance, it actually goes all the way back to the founding of our city. And it begins with a man named Ransom Montgomery. Asada, I know that you've heard me tell this story before. It's one of my very, very favorites. So
it's a great one. It's a great one. Tell our listeners about Mr. Montgomery.
Yes, so let's rewind it all the way back to the very founding of the city of Atlanta. In 1849, just 2 years after the railroad came to Atlanta, an enslaved man named Ransom Montgomery was rowing his raft on the Chattahoochee River. Now, he sees that the bridge on the Chattahoochee was on fire. There was no one nearby because, this is 1849. This whole area is just wilderness, forest. There's no, I-85.
No I-20, no 285.
No, nothing. If he wanted to go back to the village, he would have had to get onto a horse and, get himself all the way back to the village of Atlanta. And it truly was a village with like 300 people back then. So Ransom, on his own, decides that he is going to extinguish this fire. He spent the entire day trudging water from the Chattahoochee up to the bridge. He did extinguish the fire, and he ultimately saved the 100 passengers on the Western and Atlantic Railroad train, as well as the train itself. Incredible man, right?
Heroic, absolutely.
Yeah, so the entire state of Georgia, the railroad, they all were so grateful. And the state of Georgia purchased his manumission. And he, Ransom Montgomery, technically became the only slave owned by the state. But for all intents and purposes, what this meant is that he was a free man. And the Grateful Railroad gave him a small piece of land near the railroad station in the village of Atlanta. So at this time, in the late 1840s, he was only the second free Black person in Atlanta's history to own property.
Wow.
Yeah, amazing. So he built this really small house, but more importantly, he decided that he wanted to set up his own business. And the business he set up was the city's first food vendor at the train station at the time. He sold coffee and cakes at the train depot, making him Atlanta's first Black food entrepreneur and the first paid Black businessman in Atlanta's history.
Oh my God, that is so incredible. Like, he was out here doing Starbucks before Starbucks was even a twinkle in anybody's eye. Cake and coffee
you got
at a train station. That is brilliant. I love it. That just inspires me as an entrepreneur. But what's that got to do with resistance?
No, so great question. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. So, he was making bank because
Yes.
here he was. He had Starbucks at the train station back in the day,
1840s, right?
1840s, 1849. And he says, well, he's not just going to use the money for himself, he's going to support the needs of the enslaved community. So
Oh,
yes, so I told you, right? This is
right.
this is our food DNA. So he and his brother came up with a idea of building a church entirely for the enslaved population. Prior to this, the enslaved population had been basically sharing the church that the white people in the town had also attended, but the timings weren't right. So Ransom Montgomery and his brother, they receive land from Colonel L.P. Grant, who at the time was Atlanta's largest landowner, and established Bethel AME at what was then called Jenkins Street, and is today near Grady Hospital. And now this is the moment, Asada. After the Civil War, the Montgomery brothers sold the Bethel AME property and they purchased a better and bigger parcel on what was then known as Wheat Street to establish their new church, which was named Big Bethel AME.
There we go.
You got it,
That's an
right?
Atlanta icon.
Yeah, so Wheat Street in the late 1800s came to be known as Auburn Avenue. And Auburn Avenue and the Sweet Auburn neighborhood is, of course, the world famous neighborhood that birthed and housed the American Civil Rights Movement. But all that start, the Sweet Auburn neighborhood, Big Bethel AME, that start came from this one incredible man and his food entrepreneurship.
So we have Ransom to thank for Sweet Auburn, the Big Bethel legacy, and the cradle of the civil rights movement right here in our great city.
Exactly. And Ransom's story shows that food was resistance and has always been resistance here in our city. Who we are as a city, who we are as a country was built from the savings of restaurateurs, bakers, and cooks who invested and funded change. I mean, honestly, Asta, I could talk about this for hours.
I love it.
I have this is really and truly my favorite part of being a culinary historian is identifying these resistors.
I love that. I think that's such a great story, and it goes deep. It went a lot deeper than the story of the burning bridge. So I'm so happy that you shared that with us. And I can see the impact of resistors like Ransom Montgomery. But there's the dark side of resistance too. As Black food entrepreneurs grew more successful in the years after the Civil War, one of those shadows that still permeates soul food to this day is the legacy of watermelon. Even though watermelon is historically native to Africa and it was domesticated and cultivated in Africa, it was brought to the Americas through the slave trade, and it grew abundantly in the South. It still does.
And not only that, watermelon has always been an economic engine in the Black community. So even pre Civil War, I mean, we're talking about the days that we were talking about with Ransom, enslaved people were permitted to grow and sell their own watermelons, which created a modest income. But that really took off post Civil War, especially among Black women. Black women, they had this incredible agricultural prowess and they were able to make a really good living selling fruits and vegetables. And there's this incredible image. We're going to be putting it in the show notes. And it shows just 1 year after the Civil War. This is 1866. There was a watermelon market in Charleston, South Carolina. The entire market was run by Black female entrepreneurs. I mean, this is Black girl magic, right?
Absolutely.
And Atlanta had one of the largest watermelon markets in the Southeast. Many Black women made a significant living through the sale of these fruits. And because of that, I know this may sound hard to believe given this history and the way watermelon is stereotyped today. In the Reconstruction era, watermelon was a symbol of Black freedom. It was a symbol of Black resistance because free Black people grew, ate, and sold the fruit often on their own land, creating economic self sufficiency. It's actually a big part of the reason why watermelon was frequently served at Juneteenth celebrations as well.
So, Akila, I want to interject here because even though it is still served at Juneteenth and widely celebrated by all kinds of people, at some point in history, this legacy of watermelon got twisted and turned around and started being used against Black people. Can you illustrate and highlight how that came to happen?
Absolutely. I mean, that is really starting to happen in around the 1880s. And that was all of a sudden, all these white farmers and white food entrepreneurs realized that Black food entrepreneurs were threatening the racial order because Black people now had found a way to create economic self sufficiency. So white politicians, white newspapers, white media began ridiculing these early Black entrepreneurs for their success. And watermelon actually became this target, you could say. And what the Southerners, the newspapers, the politicians would say is by Black people eating watermelon, they were lazy, they were messy, they were juvenile, and they couldn't be trusted with freedom. This racist trope actually became one of the most common in the United States over the next century. And this is why we say that food as resistance has a dark side, because where Black food entrepreneurs succeeded in creating economic self sufficiency with foods that are difficult to grow or produce, like watermelon, fried chicken, and barbecue, white segregationists in the 1880s through the 1930s, they responded by turning these foods into racist stereotypes.
And I have to say that that resistance extends even further, and the African American community, as it tends to do, often reclaims something that has been recrafted as negative, and we reclaim it and we rebrand it. We're fabulous at rebranding. And so I have to say that Black
Absolutely.
entrepreneurs So in this case, the Black entrepreneurs were not different. They were not put off by these stereotypes. And soul food has often been demonized as being unhealthy or being called quote unquote slave food. And I know older people to this day that won't eat certain foods in mixed company, watermelon and fried chicken being at the top of the list. But in the early 1960s, a writer claimed that Black people had no distinctive cuisine, like the Chinese or the Italians. And Amiri Baraka, we all know Amiri Baraka, the culture critic, responded in his seminal essay titled Soul Food. And he defines soul food as, and I'm going to quote, Poppin' John, black eyed peas and rice, hush puppies, crusty cornmeal bread, cooked in fish grease and best with fried fish, amen, especially fried saltfish, which ought to soak overnight unless you're over 50 and can't take all that salt. Hoe cake, pancake, fatback, i.e. stricoline, stricker fat, dumplings, net bones, knuckles, good for both seasoning lima or string beans, okra, pork chops, and barbecue hot enough to make you whistle.
I just love the way he describes it. And if you've never read that essay, it is simply just a stunning way and a stunning reflection on soul food. And it was the first time that word soul food was even used. You could just immediately see it in front of you the moment you said barbecue hot enough to make you whistle. And that same time period, 1960s, soul food became the food of the civil rights movement. And this was resistance food. Again, one of the stories I love to tell, down the road from us, Montgomery, Alabama, not too far from where I grew up, actually, Georgia Gilmore, she sold fried chicken sandwiches to the Black men and women who participated in the Montgomery bus boycott. But she did not save that money. No, she took every penny and gave those profits directly back to the civil rights movement. She used to organize Black women to sell pound cakes and sweet potato pies, fried fish, stewed greens. And she was doing this on the side, by the way, because she also was a cook. at a restaurant in town. So she was doing this in her evenings and her weekends, whatever free time she had. And all that money helped fund the 381-day bus boycott. It paid for the insurance, the gas, the wagons, the vehicle repairs, which helped get Black people across town to the jobs without using buses. Of course, we know, I mean, that Montgomery bus boycott, that was really the moment that spurred the whole movement.
Yes, absolutely. And there was a lot of that food as resistance here in Atlanta, too, with restaurateurs. Lucy Jackson at the Busy Bee, and James and Robert Paschal, the Paschal brothers, at Paschal's restaurant, fed the civil rights movement. And these restaurants are still operational today, right here in Atlanta. And they're still serving traditional soul food in mega servings for people who are eagerly waiting in line. So if you're new to soul food, or if you have questions like, what's the difference between soul food and Southern food? These restaurants are exhibits A and B, along with other classic soul food restaurants like Q Time, This Is It, and The Beautiful. I don't want to unpack that question right here. I'm just going to say go taste and see for yourself.
Yeah, and you know what? You can't go wrong with anything there. I had to tell you, the candy yams at the Paschals, that's my perception of what candied yam should be.
Should always be.
Should always be. I feel like this might be, we've had this discussion about candied yams there multiple times because I just love it so much. But, you know, we talk about these spots like Paschal's and Busy Bee and Q Time, and This Is It, because they're still standing. But there were other Black food entrepreneurs in the 1960s who fed the resistance. Benjamin Beeman, he was an incredible restaurateur. He had a restaurant on Auburn Avenue. Dr. King used to walk over there from his offices all the time. And that became the spot where John Lewis and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they wrote their bylaws there. They planned their demonstrations there. Today, unfortunately, that restaurant is a parking lot. Evelyn Jones Frazier and her husband Luther, they fed Snick and John Lewis at their elegant Frazier's Cafe Society on Hunter Street. And again, this is a restaurant that has closed, but I want to jump and talk about how food is resistance today here in Atlanta. So I know you've been talking to a couple of different folks. What do you have on that?
Well, I want to start by just trying to describe this electric event I stumbled across during the local elections last November. Across the street from the Metropolitan Library, there was a whole party going on. I had to stop. There was this drumming beat coming from DJs, people on megaphones, a circle of food trucks, and of course, the aroma of something fried, something sweet, and something savory. So your girl had to pull over. But little did I know, I had stumbled upon a party at the polls. And it's a thing. One of 20 plus organized demonstrations that supplied voters with chairs, information, water, and food before and after they got in line to vote. And I'm sure you've experienced some long wait times with these polls before, right, Akilah?
I mean, who hasn't? Haven't we all here in Georgia, especially in the last few years? But I don't know. I think I have now lost track of how many times I've been to the polls in the last few years.
It feels like about every other month. But since the passage of SB 201, community organizations can't provide what they call voter support, which often looks like passing out water and snacks to voters as they stand in line. One organization, Georgia Stand Up, has found a solution to that, and they continue to push back against voter repression through their Party at the Polls model. I caught up with their CEO, Deborah Scott, and here's what she had to say about how Party at the Polls got started.
We were one of those groups that were what we call giving voter care. When we saw voters in line, we were handing out water and snacks and chairs, right? And so we felt like, you know, that law was probably written for organizations like us that were helping with mitigating voter suppression, if you will. And so we said, well, what can we do that could still show our communities love, show resistance? And so resistance is also a tool of movement building. So we measured beyond the 150 feet and went another 150 feet and said, okay, we're not going to just stop with just giving out water and snacks and voter information. You know what? We're going to give out whole meals. So we literally did 22 parties at the polls through general election and early voting. The residents know that we're there. If the voters know that we care, if they get the information before they even get in line, if they get the chair and get the food, then they will stay in line on their own. And we don't have to cross the street. They'll cross the street to get what they need.
And what I found to be really impactful is how Ms. Scott uses the food as resistance model demonstrated during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, even today, as a cornerstone of community organization. Here she is again describing why food is essential in organizing and strategizing in the community.
And always food is a way to connect. So any meeting that we have at Georgia Stand Up always has food. We cannot organize, strategize, or mobilize unless we set the table and literally set the table. We look at it as, what's this saying? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Literally. So what we're saying is, one, you deserve to be at the table. We will bring a chair, or we'll tell you to bring your own chair. We will help and bring the food. And we want to set that model that every time they're organizing, they're setting the table with making sure that people are fed. You can't hear me. You can't organize. You can't be educated if you have a hungry belly.
That's such an amazing quote and such an amazing story that Ms. Scott said, Asada. I have to tell you, from a historic mindset, one of the things that people always said about Dr. King and the civil rights movement is that these pastors, they always ate some really good food. In fact, there were new members of the civil rights movement who said that they could never understand how people got through the movement without gaining at least 5 to 10 pounds.
Well, they say an army marches on its stomach.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another Deborah came to mind when I was thinking about the modern manifestation of soul food, and that's the award-winning and highly acclaimed Atlanta-based chef, Deborah Von Treese.
Ooh, I love her. I love her food.
So we should, at this point, she's like a chef celebrity / spokesperson / role model, etc. Chef Von Treese has 3 restaurants in our city that are steeped in a long legacy of soul food, but with very distinct preparations. And as a chef, I've witnessed other African-American chefs shun soul food, or at least cooking it professionally. And Chef Von Treese tells us why she embraced soul food and began playing with it, as she says, to expand this unique cuisine into new realms.
Well, I define soul food probably in a few different ways. Traditionally, it's a term that we use, or I use, that's associated with the cuisine of African American culture, the cuisine that I grew up with. And, for me, through traveling, I've kind of put an extra layer on top of that. And I feel like it is food that tells a story. And the story, may include some strife. It may, show tenacity. But it shows heart. And with that in mind, I feel like that idea of soul food can be placed on foods from different cultures. The base of what I do is definitely from how I was raised, how I was brought up, and I was blessed with having an amazing, array of cooks around me, male and female, that all had specialties that they did, but what I knew was at the end of the day, I could taste love in that food. I could taste comfort in that food. There were stories being told amongst us around that food. Each restaurant, I'm still trying to tell stories.
While soul food may be their common thread, each restaurant is distinct in its menu and ambiance. And Chef Von Treese gives us a glimpse of how she has mastered and remixed soul food to create stories of food, of people, and of places in each of her restaurants.
The original bay, as I call it, is Twisted Soul Cookhouse and Fours. Somewhere along the line, it picked up the term of globally inspired soul food. And it allowed me to be very creative and, and show off. Just, quite honestly, as simple as that, show off. I had the ability to travel all over the place and dine in people's homes as well as restaurants. And the experiences that I had are those that created the concept of Twisted Soul Cookhouse in Fours. Then the next one I opened was Aretha's. Aretha's at the point. Aretha is my mother's middle name. And I wanted to pay homage to mom, because going through this culinary world, which was very and still is male dominated, the one thing that a lot of us had in common from the very beginning was the fact that who really we learned how to cook from was a woman. Way back in the day, it wasn't a thing that men were typically doing. It was women, and I wanted to bring this thing full circle and bring it back to those women.
Asta, sometimes it feels like when we're talking about soul food, the stories of resourcefulness, resistance, tenacity, and struggle, they just bubble up to the top.
Exactly. But as I was speaking with Chef Vantrease, what we discovered was the common ground of soul food in the African American tradition and across other cultures is one simple thing: love.
There's some things I've been motivated to do myself as a restaurant owner, based on that history of the civil rights movement, knowing that it was a gathering place, it was a safe place for our civil rights leaders back in the 60s or so. We would have comfort to speak our mind, to strategize. During the pandemic, when we start having the Black Lives Matter movement, for us, it was when I decided to reopen my restaurant. And one of the reasons that I did, actually, the most profound reason, was because I felt that it was time and we needed a space. It was so much that was going on that was wrong, that was dangerous. There was looting. There were restaurants in our own neighborhood still being destroyed, and even outside of our neighborhood. But, opening and having a positive space where I could bring people back together and gather, became really the reason I decided to open. And I opened the weekend of Juneteenth with all of this in mind. That's hanging on the traditions and riding the coattails of those that had came before me, just trying to follow with what they had done.
We'll post the entire interview with Chef Vantrease and links to all of these restaurants at the WABE website. And while the story of soul food continues to be written and the recognition and accolades for this contribution to American culture continue to be recognized, I think that's where I want to leave our story of soul food in Atlanta, steeped in that legacy of love.
And that's a wonderful place to leave it, because love is the ultimate act of resistance.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more info, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.